Hello, my lovely lilies. Today's entry in the Nation is a dedication to the RMS Titanic. I know the anniversary is April 15th, but out of respect, I want to wait. We have a story and some history. I hope you enjoy this, and thank you. The Titanic Coincidence. 14 years before the famous Titanic sank into the North Atlantic Ocean, a man named Morgan Andrew Robertson wrote a book about a ship. The title of the book was Futility. The ship was a triple screw, with very few lifeboats, but no one really worried. It was practically unsinkable. It was the largest ship ever created and could hold a capacity of 3,000 passengers and crew members. In the end, 2,500 passengers and crew members boarded the ship. Then, one April night, moving at 25 knots, the ship struck an iceberg on its starboard side. It was in the North Atlantic Ocean when it sank. 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland, more than half of the passengers on board perished. There are only two differences between this fictional ship and the real Titanic. The Titanic was moving 22.5 knots when it hit the iceberg, and it had only 2,200 passengers and crew members on board. As for the name of the fictional ship, it was called the Titan. Titanic. 105 years later, passenger stories continue to haunt us. The sinking of the Titanic on April 15, 1912, was a defining event in the first half of the 20th century, and the nearly 1,500 souls that were lost continue to fascinate us. The 2012 centennial anniversary brought renewed interest worldwide. The disaster played a major role in the plot of the PBS phenomenon, Downton Abbey, and the Costa Concordia grounding reminded us that human error can still cost lives. The writer of the 2012 nonfiction book, Titanic: Voices from the Disaster, explores some of the stories of the ordinary people whose lives were changed that fateful night. Here are 3 passengers who traveled in first, second, and third class. First class passenger Jack Thayer. Jack Thayer was a 17-year-old high school senior from an upper-class family, returning from a trip to Paris with his parents. In the confusion following the collision with the iceberg, Jack became separated from his parents. Jack and a young man he'd met on board, named Milton Long, stayed together as the ship's bow sank lower. Just before the Titanic sank, they decided to jump from the rail. Milton went first. Jack never saw him again. From the icy water, Jack looked up to see the Titanic's second funnel topple into the sea close by, creating a suction that pulled Jack underwater. When he surfaced, he found himself close enough to climb upon the top of Collapsible B, a lifeboat which had ended up in the water upside down. From his precautious perch, Jack witnessed the last moments of the Titanic as the stern rose, then sank under the dark, cold water. At first it was quiet. Then the cries began. Jack said that it soon became one long, continuous wailing chant from the 1,500 in the water all around us. The terrible cries faded away. The other lifeboats did not return. It was, Jack said later, the most heart-wrenching part of the whole tragedy. Of the 2,208 people on board the Titanic, 712 survived. Jack was reunited with his mother on board the rescue ship, the Carpathia, early the next morning. It was only then he found out that his father had not survived. Jack went on to a successful career. He married and had 2 sons. But it's hard not to wonder if the horror of that night ever left him. In 1945, at the age of 51, Jack Thayer committed suicide after his son Edward was killed in World War II. Second-class passengers, the Collier family. Harvey and Charlotte Collier and their 8-year-old daughter Marjorie had left home in England. They were heading to a new life on Idaho farm to improve Charlotte's health when the Titanic stopped briefly in Queenstown to pick up more passengers and drop off any mail that passengers had written. Harvey sent a cheery postcard to his folks saying in part, "My dear Mom and Dad, it doesn't seem possible we are out on the briny writing to you. Well, dears, so far we are having a delightful trip. The weather is beautiful and the ship is magnificent. We will post again at New York. Lots of love. Don't worry about us." When the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday night, April 14th, Harvey left the cabin to investigate. Upon his return, he told a sleepy Charlotte, "What do you think? We have struck an iceberg, a big one, but there is no danger. An officer just told me so." But of course, there was danger. Later, Charlotte clung to Harvey's arm, unwilling to get into a lifeboat. All around her, the sailors were shouting, "Women and children first!" Suddenly, a sailor grabbed Marjorie and threw her into a boat. Charlotte had to be physically torn from her husband. Harvey tried to reassure her, "Go, Lottie. For goodness sake, be brave and go. I'll get a seat in the other boat." A week later, safe in New York with her young daughter, Charlotte broke the news to her mother-in-law. "My dear mother, I don't know how to write you, or what to say. I feel I shall go mad sometimes. But dear, as much as my heart aches, it aches for you too, for he is your son, and the best that ever lived. Oh, mother, how can I live without him? He was so calm. The agony of that night can never be told. I haven't a thing in the world that was his, only his rings. Everything he had went down." Charlotte died from tuberculosis 2 years later. Third-class passenger, Rhoda Abbott. Rhoda Abbott was returning to America with her 2 teenage sons, Rossmore and Eugene. The family managed to reach the boat deck by climbing a steel ladder onto the stern and walking on the slanted deck over the ropes left from the lifeboats, which had already been launched. Collapsible C, one of those lifeboats with canvas sides, was being loaded, but only with women and children. At 16 and 13, the Abbott boys would be considered too old. Their mother stepped back to stay with her children. As the boat was being lowered, J. Bruce Ismay, manager-director of the White Star Line, jumped in. In the final moments, Rhoda and her boys jumped from the deck. She managed to get into collapsible A, the only woman in that boat. Her beloved sons were lost. It took a long time for Rhoda to recover from the effects of injuries and exposure she suffered that night. She never recovered from the loss of her sons and died alone and poor in 1946.
Why